Hey everyone, and welcome to the Building Geniuses podcast, where we talk to geniuses throughout the commercial real estate and building automation industries, asking them how they've gotten where they are, who's walked alongside them, and how they're helping others along the way. This is episode 4 of season 1, and I'm your host, Tim Vogel. In today's episode, we're speaking with Nate Kehr, formerly of Tridium, now of CBRE as of the release of this podcast. But Nate, welcome to the Building Geniuses podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Tim. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited for you to be here and in person. This is our first live two-person podcast.
Excellent.
So, Nate, you and I have known each other since I started at KMC.
Mm-hmm.
I believe you were my predecessor.
That's correct.
So thank you for leaving the trail of wonderful things. You've kind of on and off been a person that, we would have conversations, we'd run into each other. Mm-hmm. You understood a lot of the things that I was dealing with and, kind of the size company we are and the challenges that come with that, but then also just the huge opportunities. Yep. And so when we were and then also you've grown your career quite well. You're a mover and shaker. You play the sales role well. You fool a lot of people. Just kidding. But no, I've always kind of admired a lot of those characteristics in you. So when we talked about doing a podcast on how people grow in the industry and how they learn from others, you have always leaned on other people and asked very good questions.
Absolutely.
Particularly older people that have been in the industry that have the experience that neither of us have.
Yep.
And so I was like, absolutely, Nate needs to be on the podcast. So with that, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, and then we'll just sort of work backwards.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll give the very brief history, which we'll get into here a little bit more in a minute. I was recruited into building automation and controls from completely outside the industry. I met the gentleman who was the vice president of sales at the time of KMC, Jim Herdeman. And we had a discussion. I actually took him to lunch, and I said, this seems like the type of career that I would want to have. And so that was my introduction. It was actually a year or two later that I finally ended up coming to work at KMC. But anyway, worked at KMC as kind of the junior sales guy, eventually took on some marketing responsibilities, was here for a few years, learned a tremendous amount about the industry. During that time, we became an OEM of Tridium's Niagara framework. We became a partner of Tridium through the Vicon channel, and that was my introduction to the Niagara framework and the Niagara community. So after a few years at KMC, I had an opportunity to move to Tridium, started out there in sales, eventually took over the position managing the Vicon channel team. Incredible experience. I mean, the best community, one of the best teams in the industry. Just can't say enough about how fantastic that experience was. And then, as of this taping, I had the opportunity to move on. I accepted the role of Vice President of Sales at CBRE ESI, which is a master systems integrator based out of Milwaukee. So I'm starting that adventure right now.
Yeah, and that's some new muscle for you to go and exercise, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously learning off of all the things you've learned with your other positions and other companies. Let's start at the very beginning, entering the industry. You mentioned Jim and how he kind of introduced you to it. The industry is, some people call it kind of a black hole. Once you're in it, you can't get out, right? But you had mentioned before how it's kind of a flatter kind of industry.
Yeah.
And how you can go and talk to people and see them at shows. Talk a little bit about that and how that's been helpful for you. And
yeah, so you pointed out something that I noticed right away. I remember actually having this conversation with some of the senior sales guys at KMC. I said, this seems like the type of thing that if you do it for 5 years, you end up doing it for 35. And they laughed, right, at the time. And little did I know how true that would turn out to be. But yeah, what's interesting is for all the billions of dollars that flow through, I mean, when you think of all the construction projects and the capital equipment sales and the controls jobs and retrofits and commissioning and, I mean, all of the energy initiatives, there's billions of dollars that flow through this sector. But at its core, even though there's, tens of thousands of professionals that work
Mm-hmm.
in this space, there's a really small nucleus of, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people that kind of make all of it tick.
Mm.
And I've been really fortunate both during my time at KMC and my time at Tridium to get to know some of those people. And so when you go to those events like RealCom, IBCon, or the Niagara Summit, or KMC's Genius Summit, or even at AHR,
Mm-hmm.
they're very accessible. I mean, you can get to know, and you mentioned earlier, like Mark Peacock and Fred Gordy, other people that will be on this podcast. Those are people that you can get to know regardless
Mm-hmm.
of your background or your station or your role in the industry. Those people are accessible. And more than that, they're willing to help. I mean, they open themselves up, like their experiences, their lessons, their wisdom. They're willing to come on podcasts like this and share all of that information for the next generation. And to me, that's the most incredible part of all this. That's the most probably rewarding and interesting and fun part of being in this space. Is, like you said, it's very flat,
Mm-hmm.
and those people are very accessible. And there's just so much knowledge that you have access to. So,
What suggestion would you give to 10 years ago Nate? About 10 years ago you started,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
just
10
over.
years ago Nate, to kind of get to know those kinds of people.
Sure. So the biggest piece of advice, which I did this, I feel very fortunate that I had these opportunities, but I still wish that I would have learned more. I still wish that I would have asked more questions.
Mm.
The thing that I found, a lot of these people, that started out in the pre-digital era. I mean, a lot of them came up through the trades, or they started out, in engineering or project management or whatever in the pneumatic era, and they bridged that gap, into the digital era. And they were working on these types of systems and the integration of these types of systems as soon as that technology came available. Like, they were on the very leading edge of all of that. There's a lot of wisdom and history and context there that a lot of these people have now been promoted into management positions, or they're in advisory roles, or some of
Mm-hmm.
them have retired.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like some of that knowledge and some of those lessons that were learned, it's not that they've been lost, but there wasn't a good knowledge base or somewhere that you could kind of collect and collate all that data to make it accessible for the next generation or two. So I just wish, looking back, that I had asked more questions. And
Mm.
with all the access that I had and all the time that I got to spend with some of those legends, I still wish that I would have spent that extra 10 minutes or that extra 15 minutes, in some of
Yeah.
those conversations and tried to learn even more.
Now you're fairly naturally an inquisitive sort of person. Uh, what kinds of questions, if you could remember, it may be too specific of a question, but what kinds of questions did you start out asking?
Sure. Most of it, very, very little of it, generally speaking, would center around the technology. It was more, how did the industry come to be the way that it is? Like, where, like,
Why
because
are you the way
yeah,
that you are?
well, there. I mean, yeah, these businesses and the entire process, like the entire value chain of how these, how projects are sold and
Mm.
installed and commissioned, and the service contracts on the back end, the relationships between the companies, the different generations of product and technologies that
Mm.
integrators have to make work together. There's really fascinating history there, and a lot of it, I'm making up examples, but a lot of it, you know, was there. Maybe there was a team, a product team at a company like Train, and then a lead engineer moved over to a company like Honeywell or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and then they hired a couple of their friends, and
Mm-hmm.
so there was this natural evolution. But going back to that comment earlier, it was kind of the same key players at the epicenter of all of this that over the course of their career they moved around, they brought their friends with them, and they were able to affect change at different levels at different times in different organizations.
Mm-hmm.
But that same kind of pattern, of moving the technology forward and moving the industry forward revolved around, that kind of core group. So just learning that history and having that context for how the state of things came to be what it is today
Mm-hmm.
has been really helpful in every conversation I've had, whether you're talking to an end user, a client, a consulting specifying engineer, systems integrator, an OEM or a manufacturer. You can still find people in all of those types of organizations
Mm-hmm.
that know pieces of that history, and it provides a common thread that bridges, that conversation. It helps you build relationships, and it helps build credibility and trust with people when you kind of understand, some of their experiences.
You've the industry is sort of, and this goes for all industries, to be fair, but the industry is known for being slow to adopt new technology. And, you have a lot of older guys, whether they're on the business side or the service side, or they're a commercial real estate owner. And, the older seasoned guys I think they kind of discredit themselves by saying like, well, I'm just not a very, tech savvy person. Or, I've heard complaints before from vendors. It's like, there's just like, you get these old guys that don't want to accept new technology. And what I've found is that it's really not about them not accepting technology or not being tech savvy. It's because a lot of the new technology really doesn't do any good. It's like, what's in it for me? Like,
Right.
Why in the world do I want to say? So it's like, if anything, when we have new technology, we should go to them because they have that history and say, is this like actually a good idea?
Yeah.
And then,
or has anyone tried this before? Have you seen this kind of thing
yes.
before? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So-and-so tried this and it did not go well. It's like, well, great. Tell me why it didn't go well, because I think we could do it better. And then, you know what? Those are some of the best conversations, because then they're like, you are doing it a little bit different, and that does make the difference. And then, you got to be more collaborative in that sense.
Oh, I agree 100%.
It's less snake oil salesman and more like, conversational and how.
Correct. Yeah, and to your point, nothing about any of the way this industry works or the technology happened overnight. It evolved this way over 100 years, and it took a lot of really smart people a very long time to solve some of these sophisticated problems that they address with the controls and the technologies and the software that we have available today. So yeah, to your point, it's not like any of this happened overnight. It's not like it happened in a vacuum. It's not like it just emerged out of nowhere. A lot of very smart people put in a lot of work over decades to
Trial
get things to
and
this
error.
point. Yeah, a lot of expensive and painful lessons learned, for sure.
That's
for
right.
sure.
We're thankful for the people that went ahead of us.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I expect everyone after us to thank us also.
Well, yeah, hopefully we do it justice, right? Hopefully we carry the torch a little further. Yeah.
A previous guest said, I just want to make a difference, whether it's good or bad.
That's great.
He goes, no, I hope it's good. I'm like, yeah, that's fair. That's good. I think that's what we all want, right? So can you think of individuals that have been key to whether it was informal or formal in terms of mentoring and helping you? Who are some of those people, and how did they go about that?
Sure. Yeah. And I hate to list names like this because I'm going to leave people out inadvertently, and that's like the worst. So if I forget anyone, I apologize, because you know who you are. And one thing I really try to be diligent about is telling people that I appreciate the help that they've extended to me, or telling people, because sometimes it might be years later. You might have a relationship or spend time with someone or learn something from someone that you don't recognize in the moment as being tremendously valuable.
You realize it later.
And then 3 years later, you're like, oh my gosh.
Like a smack in the face.
Yeah. And specific, to when I started at KMC, and this is specific to kind of how the industry works and, the products and what control systems architecture looks like and why it is that way. Definitely give a lot of credit to Jim Herdeman, a gentleman also retired from here named Scott Taylor, and then your current VP of Sales, Doug Miller.
Yep.
So I would say those three, when I first started, they kind of gave me the crash course in building automation control systems, how projects are managed, how the engineering side of everything works. And that really set the foundation. And then, of course, there's just been a great team. I'm not doing a shameless plug for KMC, but KMC's engineering team, KMC's marketing team at that time, as I was coming up in that department, even finance and operations, and how, all the way down to how the controllers are built here in the factory. It was just a great place for me to learn from so many different people how this stuff works, why it's designed the way it is, why that's important, what happens when it's installed and out in the field for 20 years, 25 years, what the strengths and weaknesses of different, so I learned more about actuators and valves and things like that than I ever thought that I would too. So there were a lot of people, and then within the community of systems integrators and contractors, there were a lot of people there as well. Phil and Paul Lemieux, David Endersky, Marty Endersky. I mean, I can't even go down the list of, but a lot of KMC's customers also took time to kind of coach me up and teach me about their businesses and what they do and what works and what doesn't work. So when I moved on to Tridium, then I was blessed to work with, again, I think 3 of the top minds in the industry. I mean, I had Ed Merwin, Scott Boehm, and James Johnson. I mean, every single one of those gentlemen is a legend in their own right, in the industry.
Titans.
Yeah. And I got to spend 3 years working with all of them. Scott just retired a little over a year ago. Ed is still with Tridium and Honeywell.
Yep, saw him a couple weeks ago.
Yep. Yeah. And then James, still on the Vicon team. He runs all the Vicon Pro courses and handles all the Vicon Pro modules. So you can imagine, I mean, I learned more in one day or 1 hour of spending time around, any of those 3 gentlemen than I do in a week on my own, right? Or a month, sometimes in the field. So, and then that extends again to the broader Niagara community, right? A lot of the Vicon partners, whether it's distribution, Vicon systems integrators, great relationships with some of the other OEMs and control systems manufacturers. So, but I would say at its core, if I had to really single out like the progression, it was probably those 6 people in particular that, really helped encourage me. Really, I learned a lot of tough lessons. I learned from their mistakes. That was the big thing, right? 'Cause they would would say, hey, back in 1996, I was working on XYZ project and this happened, and I just tried to absorb as much of that as I could because it's all still relevant today. So.
Well, and I think what's important, looking back on those kinds of relationships is then to like take a pause and look at your relationships now and be like, okay, so who am I not learning enough from?
Right.
And who am I not asking enough questions of?
Yep.
Because, Gene Stutzman.
Yep.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
He just walked down the hall this morning. He stops and talks to me. And it's just one of those things where it's like, golly, like I don't spend enough time with Gene. And just how many people out there, are like that.
Kevin Mooney, Greg Salisbury, right?
Yes. I mean, just go down the KMC list. That's fine. But again, this is not a plug for KMC. What are some of the, well, let me phrase it differently. You've had successes and you've had failures, I'm sure. You've felt them both. Would you agree that you've felt or learned more from the failures?
Yeah.
Are there any particular failures, barring specifics, but are there any particular failures that you've learned from the most? And they're also probably rather fresh just because of where you are in your career. You ask someone who's 30, 40 years down the line, they have no problem telling you that story about the time something almost blew up because statutes of limitations. But, so I'm not looking for anything like that, but just in general, how have you learned from a mistake?
Sure. I would say, and these aren't so much failures as they are like someone made a mistake, as just they are what we do. This is an engineered solution sale, and for any given problem, there might be 30 possible ways to solve it, and there might be 12 that are pretty good, and there might be 5 that are actually quite good. And so when you put a bunch of smart people in a room and ask them how they would solve a particular problem or design a particular system, you're never going to necessarily get that one right answer, right? There could be a lot of right answers. But I think the types of lessons that I've learned, or the mistakes I've made, the things I've had to learn to work around, are people just don't know what they don't know necessarily. And it kind of goes back to there's a lot of the phrases and platitudes and stuff that get attributed to people like Steve Jobs or whatever, but I think most people, they understand that they need to do something, but they're not sure where to start. And so most of the mistakes or the failures that I've seen and learned from have to do with people making a lot of assumptions and going down a path to solve a problem without stopping and doing what we talked about a little bit ago, asking people that have been around for 20, 25, 30 years, right? Hey, have you ever encountered this before? Have you ever seen something like this? Has anyone else ever tried this? Or did we try this in the past, and then why didn't we continue with it? Or why don't we do it that way now? And I think all of us are, most people are motivated and biased to action, and so they want to make progress. They want to make an impact, like you said. Hopefully it's a good impact. But people make...
Prayerfully.
Right. Yeah. So people, I think we just have an inclination to, take the information that we have available, put some assumptions around it, make a decision and move forward. But like you said, most of the mistakes that I've seen or the failures we've experienced have been because people didn't stop and say, what are we really trying to accomplish here? Who do we have in our organization, or who could we call and ask if they've ever encountered something like this, or if they've ever tried something like this, or if anyone else, And I think that really touches on the heart of the spirit of this conversation, is just how much knowledge there is in the community, how helpful and how intelligent and creative a lot of people in this community are, and just how much information is available to us that maybe we don't realize, right? Maybe we don't always capitalize on.
Relationships and people.
Yep.
And humility and vulnerability, all that comes in.
Yep.
So I'm going to ask you two questions. They're the same question, but the difference is one is about personality traits and one is about professional traits.
Sure.
So this goes for anyone in the industry, but in the spirit of building people up that are coming after you or who are alongside you, what are some personality traits that you would suggest they develop to be successful in this industry? Now, there's kind of multiple levels inside the industry, right? And I think we've seen all the personality traits out there. But if you were trying to encourage someone, again, whether contractor, building owner, commercial real estate guy, whatever it is, what are some of the personality traits that you would suggest they develop?
Sure. There's several, and I'm not sure. There's only one I'm going to mention that I'm not sure you can develop into someone or bribe into someone or coerce out of someone. And that is that intrinsic motivation, right? People who wake up every day and they want to leave things better than they found them. They want to do a little bit more. They want to be a little bit better. They want to make that positive impact that we talked about before. And to me, a lot of credibility and integrity and trust and all of those relationship facets that are valuable come from that trust and that confidence that, this person's got my back, right? This person wants to do something better today than they did yesterday. They want to fix a problem. They want to help avoid a problem. They want to move the ball forward in some way. But when we talk specifically about what people can develop, that curiosity that you mentioned earlier is another one. There's so much to learn. You can have an entire career in one area of this industry. You can learn just about boilers or just about chillers and spend 40 years becoming an expert.
Electrical metering.
Oh, exactly. Anything, right? It doesn't it doesn't have to be equipment, right? So having that curiosity and waking up every day, wanting to figure out a new way to augment your skills or your experiences, I think is another thing. And the most passionate people and the most successful people that I've worked with in this industry, they have that. They've got that innate curiosity that definitely carries through. I mentioned before, I said credibility and integrity and things like that. This probably bleeds into your question about professional skills, but your reputation starts on day one, and those relationships that you build, you might meet someone at a conference, or you might meet someone on a job, or you might meet someone that works for a competitor. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, they might be on your team, right? You might be
black hole.
Yeah, you might be reporting to them. You might be offering them a job. And so having that maturity and having that foresight and having those interpersonal abilities and being genuinely curious about other people, wanting to learn from them, wanting to understand what their experiences and strengths and skills are, and how you might be able to work with them and find some kind of synergy in the future, is super important too, because
great buzzword.
Yeah. Sorry.
Synergy.
Well, I hate to.
It was so good.
We'll get into the acronyms here, and then we'll start dropping all the. I've worked with a lot of people over the years, and made friends with a lot of people over the years who, I've never worked on a project team with them. I've never worked on a sales opportunity. I've never sold them anything. They've never, sold me anything. I've never bought anything from them. There are a lot of people that just through kind of networking and knowledge transfer and going to conferences and being involved in the same circles or being involved with some of the same types of work, professional committees, like I used to be on the BACnet International Marketing Committee, right?
Yep.
That's a good one. I got to know a lot of people throughout the industry just from being involved in that. So those are the types of things that when you are open to other people's experiences and other people's knowledge and wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
you start building those relationships, and you have no idea where those could take you in the future. So that's what I would really want to impress upon someone is, be curious, and be curious about other people. Ask them what they've done, ask them what they've learned, and really, try to take those lessons, because you're not going to be able to learn it all yourself, not in any
Mm-hmm.
lifetime. But when you get 15 smart people together and you start sharing that information, you can do some really powerful things with it.
The industry is changing quickly.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of new technology. I think we all agree that's going to continue to sort of ramp up. What's the law? Is it Moore's law? Yeah, that talks about how quickly technology is going to change.
It's doubling every month.
Yeah, pretty much. So that is really where the professional skills come in.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you see in the industry that, again, people younger or in the same shoes as you, what do they need to be investing their time in, learning, getting certified on, seeking professional training, whatever it may be?
Yeah. So first of all, there's been this emphasis on STEM over the last 20 years. I think it's been hugely beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
The quality, and I have a lot of people tell me this. I mean, a lot of people that started out in the field as technicians, 30 and 35 years ago, they routinely say to me, like, man, kids today, the young people today coming into our industry, they're better with the software, they're better with the technology, their engineering skills or their troubleshooting skills or their problem solving skills are better than anyone, that I worked with back when I was coming up. But I still think it's an untapped market because we work in an area that not a lot of people know about.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a hybrid between computer science and trades, and it's a really fun, dynamic, hands-on type of profession. And so I meet young people. Sometimes I have opportunities to go to job fairs, or sometimes I'll be at a trade show or a conference, and you'll have college students coming in and you talk to them. And a lot of them will say something to me along the lines of, well, I'm a computer science major, but I don't want to sit in a dark room and write code all day,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to do that with those skills, right? If you have those engineering skills, there's a whole world of opportunities out there where you're not going to be tied to a desk.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you can make your own hours. You can have a lot of autonomy. You can manage your own projects. There are these career fields, whether you're coming from the trades or the comp sci, the people who gravitate toward these opportunities and just kind of seize that initiative end up doing really well. But it takes that kind of entrepreneurial spirit. It takes a little bit of risk taking. And so I think that the more we as an industry can get that message out to some of these students coming out of STEM fields, again, whether that's trades, computer science, engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, whatever it is, I think the more we can just kind of present this type of career field to those students or those people that are earlier in their career, the more they'll see the value in it. Because I know a lot of relatively young people who have come into this field who just, they love it. And I can see who some of them are, that 15 years from now, they're going to be the thought leaders. They're going to be the people, up on stage. They're going to be the product architects and, chief strategists at major corporations.
They're not going to be okay with the status quo.
No, not at all.
No,
Yeah.
it's like this needs to be fixed right away.
Yeah. And it's true, by the way, when you say that, the status quo, I do think there are plenty of areas of our world that could be disrupted by technology or by different business practices, sales models, things like that. But I also, going back to our point earlier, I think a lot of that disruption has come from external sources, people who look at this market and say, we can come into
it's
it.
untapped.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like, I actually think that the true disruption is going to come from within. I think it's going to be those next generations of people who really understand the systems and how they've evolved to the point that they're at today,
Yes.
that figure out a way to break them out of that box and make them do more.
That have a foundation and a team behind them that know the history.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
And that understand how things get done.
Yep.
Because things do have to get done.
Yep.
Yeah, you and I think, have both been a part of plenty of conversations about how do we scale this across 1,000 buildings. You just kind of like, you could, yeah, and but are you willing to wait, 5 to 10 years to implement, right? Because these are engineered solutions, and each one is different.
Yep.
And so how So the idea even of, of the scale, which so many outside firms come in and think that they can do.
No matter how cookie cutter you think it is, we see it a lot in retail, right? Where people say, yep, here is a facsimile of a typical store. And it's going to have 2 rooftop units and a lighting panel and whatever it is. And then the systems integrator goes out and they look at 12 stores and there are 9 different designs,
Yep.
And they're like, what?
Well, what's this
like
panel
none
for?
of these, right? like none of this was in any, you didn't tell me any of this was here.
Well, that vacuum salesman came through,
Right.
and he sold us this. Oh, that's cool. That's neat. So Nate, you talked about intrinsic motivation, which you're unsure can really be taught. Which I agree. I think there are innate qualities that people just have, and a lot of it comes from a more foundational upbringing, values, whatever it may be. Then you talked about curiosity and then credibility and integrity. What are you doing to foster those things in other people?
Sure. So it's not that I think people can't become intrinsically motivated. I think they need to find their purpose and they need to find their reason and they need to tap into their strengths, right? Everybody has a reason that they wake up in the morning. Everybody has a hobby that they're excited about. Everybody has, a family or a social circle that they want to, do well for and do well by. Everybody's motivated by something. It's just that I don't think you can force people to become motivated to do a good job. You can't force people to care. You can't force people to wake up and say, hey, I want to do 10% more tomorrow at this specific thing, right?
I want to take pride in my work today.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Right. You can't bribe them into it. You can't coerce them into it. So where the magic happens is when you find people who are passionate and curious about this technology or about, working with the types of clients that we serve or about, even just the industry that they're in and the career that they might be able to build or the relationships, right, that they've established with other people, whatever that purpose they find is that provides that motivation, where they say, yeah, you know what, I do want to be a part of this. I do think I can contribute something here, and get them excited. I think that's kind of the key takeaway. And so what I encourage people to do, a friend of mine, actually, this was not that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, a good friend of mine has done incredibly well in a career. It's an engineering related career, but it has nothing to do with our industry. And he told me he had several young engineers that were reporting to him, and they all said, I want to be like you. I want a job like yours. I want to get to go on cool trips. I want to get to go to Europe, for work. I want to get to, and he was like, this didn't just happen, right? Like I didn't just stumble into a job that allows me to do fun and interesting things. I spent like 15 years doing a lot of really hard work and doing a lot of boring stuff to get to this point. And so when I meet people that are coming up in the industry, that's what I want to tell them is it's not really like, you have to pay your dues. I don't want to be one of those old guys that's like, oh, back in my day. But what I tell them is you do have to establish, like, people need to know what your skills and abilities are. They need to know what you know. They need to know that you can communicate that clearly and effectively. They need to know that you can build relationships with other people, and so that you have that rapport when you get in front of a client or join a project team or whatever it is. So what I really try to encourage them to do is just find whatever it is that you are most interested in, whatever brings you that passion and that intrinsic motivation, and just take that and run as far with it as you can, because you don't know where that could end up. I mean, just grab that thread and keep pulling on it and see where it goes. And as long as you're still excited, you're on the right path. But the minute you start to say, I don't really want to do this, or I don't think this is for me, then you need to find that fire somewhere else, right? You need to change course or try something different, or maybe take on a different role or whatever to try to get that back.
So one of the things that I've seen is, when people talk about paying your dues, when that was expressed to me when I was younger, a young pup, I always thought it was like,
isn't that crazy? I just want to point out, isn't that crazy that we're like, back when we were younger, like now,
back in the day. Yeah. Well, no, I thought what they meant was you just have to wait.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to see, like, you're not going to be given the opportunity for another 10 years or so.
It will be your turn someday, eventually, maybe. Right.
And that's, I think ultimately that's not really what they meant.
Right.
What they meant was you're not going to know what to do for a while you're figuring all these things out. And so then once you experience, that deal that went south,
Yep.
you're not going to know how to handle it in the future. Like, when this deal may go south, it's like, well, now I know what to expect when that happens.
And what to look for early
Yeah.
on so you don't drive right
Yes.
into that
Yes.
pothole. Yeah, for sure.
Or when a sale goes well and now you have to execute,
Mm-hmm.
how do you scale your team? How do you make sure that you are able to execute? What are the things you set down so you could pick up, and having the discernment then?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we should be better at communicating with those behind us and alongside us is, it's not just about literally paying dues,
Right.
but it's like there are things you have to learn. When I first started, I was told that you're really not going to know what you're doing for about 9 to 12 months.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
18 maybe.
Yeah.
It's
And I remember thinking like, no, I mean, I'm sure I could probably pick it up, right? But again, it had nothing to do with marketing. It had nothing to do with communication skills. It had everything to do with like having any amount of confidence. So, the story for me in learning was, inputs and outputs. I get that, but like, how does it actually work, right? And so we put together this series of videos on how to wire our controllers.
Mm-hmm.
And I went and I asked like 2 or 3 people, and I wrote the script out. And by golly, I learned how to wire controllers. And it's like, this isn't terribly difficult, but there are some, gotchas here that if you don't, understand the basics of. Now I have, not that I've ever actually gone out and wired a job, full disclosure, that has not been a role that I've taken.
Let's go this afternoon.
That's fine. But I feel like because I understand it more, now I can, go and at least speak more educatedly about it. That's what paying dues is, and it just takes time. But one thing our industry doesn't have is a whole bunch of time.
Right.
We have a huge labor shortage. And so how do we more quickly onboard people into it?
Sure.
Let's say we got them excited and now they're interested. How do you onboard? Are you seeing some pretty good resources out there for people to use, or networks to join to kind of help kickstart some of this for them?
Sure. Yeah. So this bleeds into, and we could do a whole separate podcast episode just on this, but this kind of goes back to the advice, that I give to someone just starting out, or someone who's interested, or someone who's maybe they're 12 months in and they feel over their head like, what did I get myself into? The first thing is that I'm a big believer that leadership is non-positional, right? You don't have to be named a manager or an executive. I mean, you can start today as an individual contributor if you know what you're talking about and you're doing the right thing and you're, bringing resources together and bringing, like I said before, organizing and collating that knowledge to solve problems and produce results. You're leading by example, whatever role you're in. Mm-hmm. So the first thing is just taking that initiative, right? Do I want to make things better? Do I want to be a leader? The second piece of it is there's the technical resources that are available to learn. I talk to guys every single day that they're watching videos on YouTube. There's something, I haven't had to do this in 10 years. Mm-hmm. And so they're on their phone, like literally, oh, that's right. So there is plenty of content and there are plenty of resources available. I think a lot of that is freeing up people's time though. Instead of having to go really, really deep in one particular area, people are becoming a little bit more generalist, which I think is fine. And I think that that's kind of a necessary evolution. But, that continuous education is another hallmark of the people that I see that are the most successful and have the best careers and are most passionate. They are constantly, whether it's a local ASHRAE chapter meeting and they're having a guest speaker to come in, and speak on a subject, whether it's, a conference that they're going to that just happens to be in a city nearby, or whether they're at, going to their boss and saying like, hey, I want to go to this event because there are these 6 educational sessions that I really want to get to understand. I want to learn more about this vendor. If they're hosting training, like that's another thing we see a lot. People in the community will take any amount of training that they can get because, as you mentioned, they're trying to hire technicians. When they find good ones, they're like, how do we train them up as quickly as possible? And we need all the help we can get. So I do think it's up to the vendors, it's up to the manufacturers to, have subject matter experts on hand that can go in and constantly be in front of the systems integrators and the consulting specifying engineers. And in many cases, even the clients themselves that have internal groups, servicing their systems. Like, what is the latest and greatest? What are the best practices coming from the manufacturer? What's new? What's on the roadmap? What's going to be available at this time next year? It sounds like it can be overwhelming, and it can, require a significant time commitment. But at the same time, I think the overall savings, like the overall value that you're bringing in terms of saving the time and the labor and the headaches and the confusion, I think it's well worth it for people to continuously educate themselves. So yeah, and then as far as industry resources available, one I can definitely speak to is like Tridium University. We have a tremendous amount of content. I know you guys have a really robust YouTube channel, a lot of social media, tutorial videos, things like that. But I would say that pretty much each manufacturer or vendor that people in our world work with has some repository of that type of technical content. In some cases, it's even, we've got content just on how to sell Niagara, how to talk about Niagara to a consulting specifying engineer, or how to present integration to an end user. And I'm sure, as we've watched this, social media, I don't even know what you want to call it anymore. We've
debacle.
Watched this whole, right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's evolved into something that I don't think any of us ever would have predicted, even 10 years ago, right. Or 8 years ago. But as we've watched just more and more content get put on there, I think you find the most quality content by going straight to a reputable source, like by going straight to a manufacturer or something like that. But yeah, unfortunately right now, I think it still is up to the individual. If they've got gaps in their knowledge that they want to fill, you still have to go out and find that information. There's really nobody standing there just, feeding it to you. There's no
centralized governing body, saying like, this is the baseline you need to know.
Right.
And but again, that now introduces a huge amount of opportunity for system integrators, contractors, anyone to be like, I can go and get that competitive edge by, stepping up and finding those sorts of resources.
Sure. And a simple, again, this is going to sound like I'm plugging, but, Niagara Certification, right? That's one of those things that, if you're a programmer, if you're a technician, you get Niagara Certification, that opens up a whole new world. And, we see that all the time when we host training classes, like in the Richmond facility. People come in from all around the community, and they're like, when I go back to my job next week, I'm now the Niagara person, right? Yep. I'm the integration expert. That's great. That's a ton of responsibility, but that's also
terrifying.
Right.
Yeah. Well, but that's the little thing is, you could say that a lot of those trainings are self-serving for Tridium, but really it's like, no, we're empowering our people to be better at what they're doing so they can go and be more successful and serve their customers better.
Exactly.
Yes, we're the technology provider, but with something as pervasive and as widely accepted as Niagara is, it's good to have those sorts of trainings. And then, that carries over into a number of other applications as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to piggyback on that, I'm not a tech, I'm not a programmer, but I've never turned down technical training. I have taken KMC actually had a really good pneumatics training. It was a 1-day pneumatics training course that I think Kurt Wilkes put together. You know, I jumped on that the first time it was available. I sat through the pilot course. That's the type of thing, going back to curiosity and intrinsic motivation and everything. Again, to somebody that's up and coming and wants to learn about this stuff, never, ever, ever turn down an opportunity to learn something new. Take all the training you can get, spend all the time you can with people that have been doing this for 30 years, ask questions. Because that's how you learn. That's the only way you get better. That's the only way it's all cumulative, right?
So you're on the front half of your career still.
I hope.
Yes, unless you retire significantly early. Yes. As you look, and this is a very sort of broad question here, but as you look into the future of your career and how you would be able to mentor others, what opportunities do you see?
I see a tremendous amount of opportunity, for one, based solely on the fact that there appears to be more interest. When 10 years ago when I started in the industry, I didn't meet a lot of peers. I didn't meet a lot of techs, salespeople, programmers, project managers. I just didn't meet a lot of anyone that was roughly my age. And I think that there was a window for whatever reason. I don't have any data to back this up. This is purely like my anecdotal observation. There seems to be about a 15-year period where not a lot of people came into this industry. And so I don't know if I would go so far as to say we lost a generation or something like that, but I think that makes it doubly important now for people. If you're 25 to 30 years old and you're just starting out, you really do need to be bridging that gap, talking to people who are 45 or 50, that have 25 years of experience. For me personally, I try to identify the people with all those traits that we talked about before and personally encourage them to explore different areas of the industry. There might be somebody that's on kind of a technical track today that might be really good in sales. There might be somebody that's in a sales role today that would be a really good solutions architect, right? There might be somebody that is in an administrative role today that would make a fantastic project manager. And so I think the way that we're going to kind of elevate the quality and get the best out of everyone is to really encourage people to try those different things and take different chances and figure out what they want to do, because I think the industry as a whole is a great place for them to be. And if they can kind of find their best seat on the bus and figure out what they want to do that gives them that purpose we talked about earlier, I think there's just there are hundreds. I meet them all the time. I meet them at events. I see them at conferences. There are hundreds and thousands of new, motivated young people that are pouring into this industry. And I think it's up to us. It's up to the manufacturers. It's up to, to find ways to identify and train and offer them the development opportunities that they need so that, 15 years from now, they're going to be changing the world for sure.
World changers. Well, and it's we really need to be intentional about that.
100%.
Yeah. So Nate, I really appreciate you coming on this. This was a fun conversation.
Thanks, Tim. I agree.
I just want to reiterate that it's good to know you, and I appreciate your intrinsic motivation and your curiosity and the way that you the way you carry yourself and share that information. It's always great speaking with you. I just appreciate it. I really do consider you a building genius in this industry. And, when you think about those titans, I don't think it's unreasonable that you would not be. I don't think it's unreasonable that you would be one of those titans. So just keep doing what you're doing with that same mentality. And I think it's bound to happen.
Well, thank you. Likewise, I'm glad to be here. And that's my parting thought would be, that's something that you work for every day. Hopefully 15 years from now, 20 years from now, I would be considered among the ranks of those people. But like you said, you got to be intentional about it. It's something you never stop learning, never stop developing.
That's right.
You have to want it. So
humility, vulnerability, integrity.
Yep.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me, Tim. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Nate. So that wraps this episode of the Building Geniuses podcast, a production of KMC Controls. If you've enjoyed this conversation, we encourage you to subscribe and share. And if there's anyone you know who should be on our podcast, tag them in the comments or reach out to us on social. We'll tag them in the comments. And as always, we appreciate you listening. And until next time, learn something new, teach someone something, and build your inner genius.